out in the lobby, if you would start gathering in here so we can get started on time. We have a full morning. We'd like to get things going as soon as possible. Thank you. Boy, it really feels like we're spread out. If those of you at least coming in, would you move forward a bit? It would be helpful. Well, we're going to ring the traditional church bell here. Coralie is going to lead us in I Owe the Lord a Morning Song. I think this is a standing song.
If you would turn in your blue hymnal to 651 for I Owe the Lord Morning Song.
I owe the Lord a morning
One of the perks of being on outreach and service is we often get to meet with our input people for a meal that you guys don't get a part of. So that is a advertisement for our new people that need to be on the outreach and service for next year. So last evening, Geraldo and Mimi invited us to their house for a Peruvian, Bolivian food, and it was very good and fun to visit. But as we sat around the table, somehow we got on the subject of names, and then I thought, you know, I don't think we have the right name in the bulletin for Juan. We have Juan Sebastian. And in our discussion, we found out how important all the names are in a different culture from ours. So Juan, would you come up and help us understand the importance and how these names come about?
Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ken. Yeah. And thanks for the invitation to be here with all of you. It's a privilege for me to be here. But Juan Sebastian is just my first and middle name. I have two and then two last names. So my first last name is Pacheco, and the second one is Lozano. And I tend to use my whole name when I'm in meetings or when I have to do everything that I need to introduce myself. I tend to use my whole name, Juan Sebastian Pacheco Lozano. And that's for a reason, and I was sharing that last night with folks at dinner. And it's because mostly in most countries in Latin America, I'm from Colombia, but in most countries we tend to use both last names because one is the father's last name and the other one is the mother's last name. And in my case, my parents separated when I was 8 or 9 or so. But always, all the time, people just called me by my first last name. And I was like, no, I was raised by my mother. I need her to be remembered, and I want to remember her. And I did that through always using the Lozano, that is her last name. And that's why, and that's one of the reasons I like to use my full name. And again, for people to get familiarized with that, because that's not common either here. And so, yeah.
And then there's also in other countries, the father's last name is first, or the other way around.
Yes, Geraldo was sharing that in Brazil, the mother's last name goes first and the father's last name goes second. They still use both, but the mother's one goes first. And so again, it's just cultural differences in this country. So, yeah.
So, and Geraldo, sometime ask Geraldo and Mimi about what their full name is. She is very touchy about that. Talk to her. We had fun with that last night. So let's have a word of prayer before we go. Father, we pray that as we study together and as we learn together, that you might give us the points where we can plug in and be a better citizen for you in this country. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
I need to time myself because otherwise you're going to have me rambling here about my work. I'm really passionate about my work. But I work with Mennonite Central Committee, MCC, and I'm sure you're familiarized with it. And I'm really pleased to have been invited here to speak on behalf of MCC, but we have other MCC staff here, and I'm sure you're going to have other interactions with other folks from MCC. So thank you so much, first of all, for your support of MCC. And again, thanks for the invitation and the opportunity, in my case, for me to be here. I'm the Peace and Justice Coordinator for the MCC Great Lakes region. And I'm not sure if you're familiarized with the schematics of the organization, but MCC works in 4 regions here in the US, and most of the regions have some kind of peace and justice related work going on. So we have the East Coast office, Great Lakes, Central States, and West Coast, and that's how we divide all of our work, our vast work here in the US. And part of my role as Peace and Justice Coordinator, for those of you who weren't here last night, we used a learning tool called You Got Booked to talk about mass incarceration and racial disparity. And as you can see, that's part of my role as Peace and Justice Coordinator. So I do restorative justice and mass incarceration work. Again, a lot of my work is education and advocacy opportunities for our constituency. So try to share the information that we have and try to promote the learning tools that we use to raise awareness about the specific issues. The other one is peace and justice education and immigration. And this morning, I'm going to be focusing on that one and immigration specifically. We also work with preventing gun violence and dismantling the doctrine of discovery and anti-racism and networking and advocacy efforts. That's kind of an overview of what we do or what I do as Peace and Justice Coordinator. This is part of the verse that I'm going to use this morning for the service as well. But I really like this part, and that speaks to me and speaks to the work that I do, and I think that's really important for us to just focus a little bit and read that one. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. I think that covers a lot of our Christian mandate, what should be our Christian mandate. And again, that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm doing the kind of work that I'm doing. There's more passages in the Bible that talk or gives us clues about immigration-related work, and I just wanted to note those and go through them and see how God mentions or talks to us in terms of how to relate to others, how to relate to people that are not from our community, how to relate to people that are not from this country or our country, and so on. And I think another one that I like to point out is this one that says, when an alien resides with you in your land, just side mark, the word alien is a little bit funny to me, and I think I'm going to mention that in the service, because I don't know, for me it's always weird to think about an alien, someone from outer space, and we're talking about human beings here, and this is embodied and this is printed in the Bible, but also in U.S. law, for instance, immigration law. This is a term that is used, and it's off. It feels a little bit off to me to always think about myself, an immigrant, as an alien, for instance. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And that is in Leviticus. I don't need to point this, right? Okay. And again, there's other references to how we should treat others, and again, not just foreigners or not just people coming from other countries or other places, but again, how to do and how to treat each other in a community. Fun facts about immigration in the Bible. Immigrant appears in one form or another 92 times in the Old Testament. Most often, we find the immigrant references in positive senses. And I think right now, in the context that we are here in the U.S., immigrant or immigration is kind of, is not put in the best image, doesn't have the best image. And again, I think it's important for us always to go back to the references that we have, in this case, the Bible, and also to look around in our community and see who is residing beside us. And God says the standard for Israelites, for instance, that the immigrants who come to dwell among them should be treated as native among you. So again, another clue on how we should treat, and I'm just not talking about people of the U.S., but in general, how Christians, how we should treat others that come to our communities as guests, as hosts, as immigrants, and so on. And immigrants are mentioned in the Bible in different forms. You won't just find immigrant, for instance, but you will find a stranger, an alien, a traveler, an angel even, and that they are treated as citizens. And I think that's important for me to highlight this morning. So how do we start the conversation? Sometimes talking about immigration sometimes is difficult. And it depends of your background, where you were raised, where you go to school, if you have had the opportunity to travel to other places and to meet other people, you'll have a different perspective around that. But I think just for personal reflection, just think for a second, what are the current feelings about immigration in the US? And just take 30 seconds just to think and go through your mind, what are your thoughts, or what is going on in our community, what is going on in our country? And again, as I was mentioning at the beginning, another question would be, what has been the public perception of immigrants at different times in US history? So don't just go back to the recent years, but go back to maybe the time that your parents or your grandparents came to the US. What was the perception of them at that time? And again, always go back to what is the Bible telling us about immigration. There is a really interesting slide that I always like go through in terms of how we think about immigrants or immigration in the past and in the present, and that it's really interesting. So in the past, you'll see in books and history books and so on that oftentimes immigrants are referred as settlers, explorers. So they're not just coming to, I'm not going to get ahead of myself, as pilgrims, as colonizers or colonists, as pioneers. And again, you can see all of those terms are more in a, you would say, a positive sense or a positive way. But let's see how nowadays we are perceiving immigrants in our country. Usually immigrant is someone that might be an illegal immigrant, and that goes to mind when you heard immigration. Undocumented, refugee, asylum seeker, alien or illegal alien, border crosser, criminal, and after 9/11, terrorist. Dreamers, illegal or wetbacks. And that's, can I go back one slide? Do I have to click all over? Okay, we'll just keep going. I think it's important to keep in mind, as it says in the bottom, that with the criminalization of immigration, again, our tendency or the tendency for our communities and our churches sometimes is to think about immigrants in a harsher way. And I think that's something that we need to continue revising and reviewing as we continue the conversation on how to welcome people from other places. And again, once again, I always do the exercise of how would you and your family members that immigrated to this country would have liked to be treated at that point in time and would have liked to be perceived at that point in time when they came. Yeah, please. And again, words are always important, and definitions are important and matter. Not, we can't talk about all kinds of immigrants, and we cannot pack them in just one bag or in one characteristic. And I wanted to define at least these four because are the ones that are being more referred to nowadays. So the first one is refugee. A refugee is international status. It's not just the US. When people are fleeing war for any specific reason, you become a refugee. People that came back in the time from Ukraine and from Russia and from other places to the US, they were refugees and they were seeking safe passage to the US. And some of your ancestors would have done that trip and would have been refugees and would have been welcome in this country or in other countries during the war in Europe. Migrant And again, there's a tendency to confuse migrant with immigrant, and I think that's important to separate those. Migrant, we all could be migrants. If we move from Sonnenberg or Orville or Worcester to, I don't know, New York City, to the West Coast, to anywhere, we are migrating. We're moving from one place to another. We're migrants. And that could be within the same country, or you can go abroad, and you're still a migrant, because also there's a condition that if you want to come back to your hometown, you can just come back to your hometown. There's no problem about that. But immigrant means a permanent move. So you're going somewhere else to, usually because you have some kind of family relationship, or again, in other cases, because of war, or because you're seeking asylum, and so on. So again, it's more a permanent move or shift of your life from one place to the other, and sometimes that's due to some kind of disruption in your home country, in your home community. And again, asylum seekers and refugees, those are not just things that happen here in the US. Those are international recognized figures that people use because in certain circumstances, especially in this case, for instance, war, that we have in war in Ukraine, or violence in Ukraine, people are seeking asylum, seeking to go somewhere else to another country to be able to find refuge somehow, or to find peace, and then hopefully, if they can, come back to their home country. And again, the question is, how do, as Anabaptists, and how do, as Mennonites and Christians, should approach the subject? And I like this quote from a Mennonite publication, that he says that there's two traditions in US history to talk about immigration. The United States has two traditions in immigration policy. One tradition welcomed the stranger, holding out the promise of a better, richer life in America. And I always, for this first part, I think about, for instance, when back in the time in US history, the railroads were being constructed. So again, you need to move all kinds of resources through the railroads. And who were the people working in the railroads? Sometimes, and most of the times, were immigrants. And at that point in time, were Chinese immigrants that came to the US. The first Immigration Act or immigration law enacted in the US was the Chinese Exclusion Act. And again, that gives you a clue that what is going to happen, or what is the purpose of the first immigration law in the US. And that law said that yes, you can come and work for the time that we need you to work, but you cannot bring your relatives. You can stay, if you want to come back to the US, you need to go back to, in this case, China, and stay there for over 10 years, and then maybe you can come back to the US. So these people came, work in the railroad, construction, and not just people from China, but other people from around the world. They came, they worked here in specific jobs, and then they were sent back because their time was done. And again, that's kind of the relationship that sometimes we feel. So again, people working on the field, sometimes they have temporary visas, people that come from other countries work a specific time, and then they have to go back. Because, yeah, they benefit the economy here, and that's the important part, but then you can stay. You need to go back. You need to go to your own place. So again, it's really important to think that. And the second notable tradition has been one that in times of crisis uses the foreign-born as a scapegoat for unsolved social problems in the US. So whenever something happens, the economy, or we have lack of jobs, and so on, there's somewhere a narrative somewhere, or someone will talk about immigrants as a problem, and immigrants taking jobs from people, and so on and so forth. And again, it depends from the lens that you use to look at that specific context. And this is a video, but I'm not going to
join us and share.
Show the video. I'm just going to talk a little bit, go over the work that MTC do in terms of immigration. We have offices, again, here in the US and in over 52 countries in the world. And part of the work that we do specifically related to migration is migration prevention. So we try to provide resources in other countries where people not have the necessity to move. for people to have productive projects that they can work in their home communities, or ways that they can engage more with their own communities so they don't have to make a trip or they don't have to get out. But sometimes, in the specific cases, that's just not the case, and we cannot prevent people from moving. We try it as much as we can, and we do a good job through our partners in a specific country. So we have partners, for instance, in Mexico and Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, even Colombia. We have offices in Colombia. And again, we try to work through partners and try to meet the needs of the communities that we are working with, Anabaptist communities, Mennonite communities, and that's, again, for me, it's important to think that it's not just people sometimes migrating are not just, I don't know, Catholics or some other denomination. There's Mennonites making these trips. And again, it's important for me to put that in your mindset. It's not just someone outside of our own community. No, there's people that belong to our umbrella of Anabaptist or Mennonite, or are people just like us, like me. I'm a Mennonite. I grew up Mennonite, and I immigrated to the US in this case. We also do accompaniment on the journey. So again, when people have no choice but leave, we try to set up, again, working through our partners to be able to provide some kind of relief or to fulfill some kind of need that people have where they're moving. And so again, through partners, we sometimes provide immigration care kits, just provide specific items that we can send to people, and that people, shoes, shoelaces, toothpaste, the basic things. And again, we just provide a service. Sometimes we have contact with people that work with lawyers or that has some kind of direct services office in different places, and we put them in contact with those so they can somehow resolve their legal situation. And if they need to continue moving, well, they need to continue moving. But if they can stay or go back, well, that would be also preferable, because their families and their people that live with them are going to be left behind. Legal assistance, as I mentioned, we partner with offices here in Great Lakes region, in Goshen and Chicago, and I think closer to here is Archbold. There are organizations that do direct services with immigrants, whether it is seeking humanitarian visas, for instance, or family reunification. Sometimes people come here and they just want their family members to come and be with them, be as a family, and I think that's completely normal. So again, sometimes we receive calls late at night, hey, we have this issue, this person is looking for, or is applying for asylum, but the lawyer, for instance, is not a very good lawyer. Can you help us with something? And we put them in contact with these organizations that do the legal work, and again, we support them, and we try for that person to be as good as possible. Sometimes they need to they're deported, and that's kind of the heartbreaking part of the thing. Sometimes there's nothing that we as MCC or our partners can do to prevent that to happen, because it's just what happens. And resettlement, and I think Canada is like leading the US in terms of resettlement, and they have our resettlement program put in place, and it's impressive. But I think little by little, churches are starting to think about, for instance, in sponsoring people seeking asylum, or that are already here and want their asylum cases, but they don't have any additional resources. And so how, as churches and communities are kind of like gathering around this family sometimes to see how they can best serve them, to be able for them to succeed here in the US, and I think that's really important. But again, it's just a work that is starting, and we have right now a position in MCC that is specifically, in the US, that is specifically dedicated to resettlement, but also for people interested in sponsoring people coming to the US, or they're already here, for them to be able to stay here.
Juan,
Yes.
when you say Canada, the head of US, are you talking about MCC Canada or just
I think is, well, MTC Canada has a lot of work in resettlement, but I think the government has like a huge resettlement program. Yes, if you have any questions, you can just, we're more informal here, right? So yeah, if you have any questions, you can just raise your hand. Thanks, Ken. But yeah, the government has a huge resettlement program, but also MTC Canada has a really vast experience with resettlement. One of the examples that I was providing earlier was we had, a couple of years ago, MCC Immigrant Detention Care Kits. So when there was a need at the southern border, because people were just coming but were not able to cross for different reasons, partners started to ask us, like, we are running out of resources, and these people don't have resources. Or sometimes people were seeking asylum, crossing to the US, fighting their cases, but they needed to fight their cases from a detention facility. And they didn't have, again, toothpaste, toothbrush, or the things that we take for granted sometimes. So we put together a kit, and we sent those resources to the border for our partner organizations. Yes, thank you. Yes, I was going to mention that. And again, I think you've seen some of this, the things that were donated. And MTC Great Lakes received over 80 immigration care kits and disperse or donate over $30,000 to this project. And again, other regions did the same and responded in different ways to this specific context that was happening at the border. One of some stories that I wanted to share is at that point, one church in Fresno had like 70 kids, but they had no way to transport them to Texas. And so they asked MTC if MTC would be willing to do that. And so again, one of the staff members made the trip and collected from Seattle down to the Pacific West Coast, went through all of the Mennonite churches and collected all of the items to be able to take them then to Texas. So that was quite a trip, and she was able to have different speaking engagements throughout the way with different churches and different groups of people that were interested in this. And I think another one was one interaction that she had along that route with one person that approached to her and said, she shared what we were doing at that point, and he said, I didn't thought that Christians were doing anything about the border or immigration. So again, that's a way that we responded to that issue. Other things that I do, I lead Borderlands learning tours. I don't know if any of you have been in a Borderlands learning tour. Haroldo, have you been in one? No? Okay, you need to be in one. So we take groups of people from the region, churches, sometimes high schools, or people that are interested, and we take them to the border, usually to Tucson, Arizona, where we meet, and we have meetings with partners that are working directly with immigrants, and then we cross the border to Mexico, and we see the reality from the other side, and we meet immigrants that are in transition or that are trying to make it to the U.S., and the reasons why they are making it to the U.S., because I think sometimes we just feel that they're just traveling because they want to travel, or come to the U.S. because they just want to come to the U.S., and I think that's not the reality, and that's a complex issue, but again, having connections or connecting with people, again, ultimately, you're connecting with people, we're human beings, and knowing their stories is really powerful and really important. So again, the purposes or outcomes of the learning tour is educational and advocacy mostly. So again, people having an experience, but not just going to a trip and go to Mexico and come back and that's it, no. For us, the goal is to equip those folks and to equip the communities that those folks represent to be able to do some kind of work locally. This is part of when we go to learning tours, we again connect through partners, and this is kind of, you can see it clearly, but this is kind of the landscape of how the border world looks, and this has changed throughout the years. And again, some of the things that we do is a devotion at the border wall. So we go and we pray for people that have lost their lives making a trip. And again, we also pray for people that are trying to make the trip because they're running from a difficult context or situation. And again, prayer, as you know, is one of the most powerful things that we as Christians have and can do. And again, when I had, for instance, the image of a border wall, I thought that it was an actual wall. And again, when I got there and I saw kind of the different settings or the different ways that they construct a border wall, like this is more like a fence. It's a border fence. And sometimes they have this, laser I can point, yes. These have this Normandy kind of type barriers, and that's just for vehicles. So the thing, or one of the things that I wanted to share is that border walls or walls like this is a double wall actually. Walls like that are only present in where towns are next to each other, so towns in Mexico and towns in the US, because it's easier for people to cross and blend in with in the US side and back and forth. So again, you need a physical barrier, or the idea is to have a physical barrier to prevent people from crossing. But again, we also need to think that back in the time, and that's kind of the stories that we hear, when before these border walls were constructed, those communities or those two cities, for instance, across each other, were kind of an organism that worked together. So the economy depending one from the other, and the succeed of one was dependent on the succeed of the other. And again, sometimes, and we have histories, that you have family members in one side and in the other side, and now you're not able to meet because of this barrier that is being in place at that point. And again, as you know, one of the consequences of people making the trip to the US is they need to cross through the desert, right? But again, sometimes it happens more often than that people will like, that people will pass away in the desert because of extreme conditions, of course. And sometimes, I think the worst thing that can happen is also that we have right now DNA testing, and you can know, or you can trace your lineage back to I don't know what, and you can see what different races you are. Like there's DNA tests going all over the place right now. But in this case, these people were not being able to be identified because there were not records of any kind here in the US, but also in their home countries or their home communities for them to be able to be identified, and they just need to be buried. It says unidentified male, and the date that they were found in the desert. And that's, again, one of the hardships of that. There's a person, he's actually from Colombia, but he came to the US when he was young, and he's a veteran of war, serving for the US military. But then when he came back, he realized he wanted to do something for other people. And one of his projects was this. And he got GPS coordinates from the coroner's office and the police office officers that attend, for instance, when they found a body in the desert. And he went to the desert and put crosses down where people were found, and that was kind of his way to remembering those people and to keep their memories alive, kind of. And again, if one day a family member kind of claims or somehow there's a connection that this body can be matched to a certain specific family, well, that could happen as well. Our deserts, our natural environment serve as a natural and lethal deterrent for illegal immigrants. We also meet with, we just not talk to people working with immigrants. We also try to go through the other side and see from their perspective what they do. And this is the word from a Border Patrol agent down in Douglas, Arizona. And again, it's in the law that the desert or natural resources are used in the US as a deterrent for people to come. But again, what happens more often than never is that people endure and people continue making that trip because they have a specific need or they cannot just stay back. This is an image from one of the times that we went, that this is in the US side, but I don't know if you can see here, this is a Border Patrol car, and these are Border Patrol officers, and this is a kid. He's probably 10, 11 years old. So he crossed to the US as we do usually like border wall infrastructure tour. So we go through different places and different points at the border, next to the border wall on the US side, and just see how everything looks like and interact sometimes with Border Patrol agents. But again, in this case, someone crossed, we were on our van, and this Border Patrol car just went past us way fast and then detained, and out of nowhere, they pull out this little person here, this kid. And I'm pretty sure I saw this kid next day in court. So he was detained, and sometimes people have the sense that when people are detained, they're just returned back to the other countries. No, they're charged with a criminal offense. Right now, crossing the border is a criminal offense, and so they're charged. They need to serve time in the US, and then they go back to their countries. So it's not that they just catch him and release him back to their country. That doesn't happen. And you saw also when there was a time in history about family separation, right? And people or kids being held in cages and detention facilities. And this is the thing that they were covering themselves with, those metal kind of sheets that you saw in pictures. That's the size of one. This is my wife's cell phone, and I wanted to compare the two of them, but this is the size of the thing. So something this big, could provide warmth for a kid. That was kind of incredible to me, and then they were doing that. I think I already talked about this. Okay, so how to engage with this issue. Again, donate to Mtcx, and we'll put your resources into great use. And you can learn, and again, considering doing learning tours. There was a learning tour to Honduras and Guatemala back in the time, and I think after now, or as we are moving from COVID-19, they're starting to open up and providing those opportunities. And we also, again, have learning tours to the border, and you can contact us if you're interested in those. Also in September, usually, or throughout the year, Mtcx sponsors and provides scholarship for people interested in doing legal immigration services, direct services. And we provide a training in basic immigration law, and there's an advanced immigration law training for, again, lawyers and all kinds of people, paralegals, or people in the community that are interested in doing this, or to get accredited to the Department of Justice to do this kind of work, and that's something that we try to do. Again, share stories. You heard some of the stories from the Bible here today. Maybe you can share those with your family members and with other community members. And I think that's important to continue the topic alive. And pray, again, that's one of our greatest assets as Christians. Pray for those who are suffering some kind or somehow through this immigration process. And this is kind of the harder part of the presentation. This train, I don't know if you know anything about how immigrants kind of do the journey, sometimes afoot, and sometimes when they get to Mexico, they get into this train. This train is called the Beast. That's kind of how it's named. And more times, sometimes more than others, you will find yourself, this is now a luxury train that you have, good seats and food and other kinds of things, accommodations. No, this train, this is a cargo train, so you go on top and some of this, but the trips or sometimes the trip that lasts days, and you have to be on top of that train and during all kinds of weather. And again, sometimes people fall asleep. They fell off the train, and the train does not stop, of course, for anyone to be picked up. So people are running alongside the train to get on the train, then to be transported. But sometimes, again, people fell asleep, they fall down, and unfortunately they die because of the impact of falling down one of those. And those trains are also controlled by illegal groups, of course, armed groups in different places. So again, it's also a business how people are transported. I feel as of now, for a coyote or for someone to transport you from one place to the other, it's up to $10,000. So again, you need, this is my other point, and I think this is really important. For you to migrate or to immigrate to another country, whether it's legal or illegally, you need to have resources. If you don't have resources, you don't do the travel, you don't do the trip. And sometimes families, even though they're so desperate to get out or because they're living in a violent context, that sometimes people sacrifice everything they have for one person to maybe be able to make the trip. So a family will lose their house, lose their lands, or their jobs and everything. They will sacrifice anything for just one person to do this trip, and they have to go through all of this. And this is another picture that impacts me. Kids involved in this whole situation. And we have heard recently also that more kids are getting here unaccompanied minors, just getting here without parents or anything, just because their families are desperate. Maybe they don't have a future in their home communities, so they just send the kids alone to do this journey. And I think I'm going to finish with this image and then open it up for questions or observations or whatever you may have. But I took this picture in a shelter, in a migrant shelter in Mexico, in Agua Prieta, that is border town with Douglas, Arizona. And we partnered with this shelter to provide, again, food and other things to people in transit. And again, this you can see the train is the beast, so the painter represented the beast, or I'm guessing he did the trip on that train. And Jesus on top of the train sharing with the immigrants that are there. And I think for me, or to me, that's one of the most beautiful images that, again, you can be going through the harshest of time, and Jesus is still there with you, sitting alongside you, being with you, sharing the pain and sharing the trip, just to say that, and that he's there listening to you and sharing with you this experience. And I think that's very important. That was really, really, really important and touchy for me to see that image and a powerful image. Because again, as I mentioned, there's Christians, there are Mennonites, there are all kinds of people from all kinds of ways of life that are doing this trip. And I think that's something that we need to consider. So I'll leave it at there, and I'll just open it up for questions. I think we have like 5 minutes or so, maybe? Yes, Haroldo.
Something that I would like to share, like MCC, Open Arms, it's working the same way with partnership. We're so glad for this church that to be a big supporter of the ministry financially, but now we're moving to another phase of the ministry. We need volunteers. Let's say we have a program right now that's a tutoring program to teach, to help immigrant kids that parents don't know English, that they cannot help these kids. And then we're pairing one kid with one mentor. It's 1 or 2 hours a week with this person, this kid. And then like, now we're looking for volunteers to run, to help, programs like that. It's kind of being local, doing the work, okay, with families, with kids. And when you talk about Deaf and Mute Kids, 3 years ago, we made a huge donation. We had a community event at the Orville Mennonite that we sent, I don't know how many kids, I can't remember, but it was a good number. Just saying that we can do a lot locally, okay, and you can ask Open Arms the way that we can engage on this work.
Thanks, Haroldo.
All do together.
And I think that's one of the questions that we receive the most after we do a presentation or after we do anything, what we can do. And I think there's an opportunity locally to do something. So again, reach out and to Haroldo and see what you can help with. And again, sometimes I think it's really important to go to your local representatives and to vote and to kind of do that kind of work, and that's really important, yes. But I think it's also important to look day by day for who is in our neighborhood, who is in this community, in this church, and to try to find ways to connect and to be able to do something with that if, yes.
There's so many hordes of people who need help.
Yes.
How does MCC or any organization zero in on who you can help? Because you can't help everybody.
Mhm.
How do you decide who you help?
I think internationally, with international programs, we rely on our partners. And so our partners will tell you, like, this is the way that we would like to go. So we don't go to other countries, set up shop, and decide whatever we want. No. We consult with local churches, and we consult with our partners, Mennonite churches, of course, with our partners, and see what they think is the best way to go. Nationally, here in the US, and I think the same in Canada, we have a little bit more discretion to decide what kind of, I think also depends on the region, and the regions work differently. But again, in the Great Lakes region, we also rely on our partners and our communities. And so if our partners tell us, like, I think this group of people is suffering this specific thing, and we think MCC can help, then we'll provide the help. And again, we, as you know, we have sent many kids to school kids, and I just participated in a conference batch sewing session 2 days ago. And again, we send those kinds of things elsewhere, and I think right now they're focusing on Ukraine and places around. And I think Sarah has more information about those. So if you have one more information, you can talk to Sarah. Anyone else?
Are there any proper channels for folks to, like, specifically Mexico, to come into the United States? Like, my disconnect is always, if I walk over the border to Canada, they're going to frown upon that. But so there's this humanitarian issue of, like, lives being lost.
Mm-hmm.
But are there proper channels that any of them can get to the United States? I mean, we've been here 200 years as Sonnenberg, and we kind of celebrate that, like,
Mm-hmm.
immigrant or migrant history. So we're all in that, we've all come from that.
Mm-hmm.
But are there any, like, channels that they can migrate this way? Or is that just shut, like, currently just?
I think it depends again on like where the people are coming from and what are the specific of the context. So I think that's it. Like if you're flying, for instance, from violence in El Salvador, that's mostly related to gang violence or something like that, and that means that you cannot like go back. And again, so there you have this family that are in limbo because they don't have a way to go here or to go back. But the legal way is asylum, because that's established in the law, and not just in U.S. law, but international law. Asylum and refugee are two valid status here and throughout the world. And that's the legal mechanism through which people can access. And again, there's other kinds of humanitarian visas. So people that have been involved in victims of human trafficking or sexual exploitation. There are specific visas that are granted to those kinds of people. But again, access, that's another point. Access to visas in countries, again, it requires resources and is extremely difficult. So again, you have to have properties, for instance, in your country. You have to have a good job and good pay, and mostly family. For instance, in the case of Colombia, if you want to have access, for instance, to a tourist visa. If you don't have any of those, they will deny that. And so again, think about corn farmer or a coffee farmer in Oaxaca, Mexico in the south, that they don't have any of those resources. So they don't have the ways to access a visa to come to the US, and they're trying to do something because there's violence present. So again, it depends on the context, and it depends on the availability of the tools or the legal tools that the US has. But asylum is a valid tool, and also it's not that everyone seeking asylum can be granted asylum. Like there's a specific rules and specific ways or things that you need to there's a checklist. If you don't meet those criteria, you cannot be granted asylum.
Let me just give a quick point on that.
Sure.
Our immigration law in the United States, it's almost 40 years old, okay? And then think 4 years ago, almost,
Okay, I'm gonna
the
close
last
now.
immigration law
I'm gonna close now.
Ronald Reagan, 1986. In that time, 3 million, almost 4 million people was legalized in the United States. From there, we just had everything that got worse. Patriot Act, everything that makes people's lives difficult. I work with some companies that they bring workers, let's say from Mexico. It's like he said, it's really hard. We need to have resources. We need to know politicians. We need to know the community to get this. Usually, if you are poor, the person that needs, they don't have these resources. When we talk about asylum, let's say 1,000 cases, maybe one person will be granted. It's like the laws, it's against, like he said about the Chinese in 1900s. Now, our immigration law, it's against immigration. Like now we walk in this country, everywhere they look for workers because we don't have workers. But we don't give people opportunity to apply to be legalized. Why? Because politicians in Washington are making money through suffering of people. Just to give you a quick understanding.
I think the last thing, as we close, because I'm already running late, but in criminal law, people have, you are granted a lawyer if you cannot represent yourself. In immigration law, you don't. You need to pay for a lawyer. And again, if you don't have the resources, you are not going to be able to fight your case. And that's why there was a huge news and shock. Kids from 5 years to 11 years or 12 or 15 representing themselves in court against a set of lawyers representing the US government, and they are seeking asylum and claiming asylum. That's kind of what Haroldo is saying. The system is not set up to be able to provide a good service for people. No, the burden of proof is on the people coming, and they need to prove that they're here for a good reasons. And if their lawyers say no, that's it. I'm going to close it there. Thank you so much for having me. If you have any other questions or comments, I'll be out and about after the service.
Yeah, and just to say too that after the noon meal, we will have kind of a wrap-up session, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and let Juan also challenge us as a church as to some of the things that we might think about for us to do. So anybody is welcome. I especially want to invite CLT to be there for as church leaders so we can process